Hi, and welcome to another episode of This Week in Plymouth. I am your town manager and your host, Derek Brindisi. It's been a few months, I think, since we've last convened. So this week we have Lee Hartmann, our planning director, joining us, and Judi Barrett, one of our consultants, on a very important topic we're going to discuss this afternoon. So thank you both for joining us. But before we begin, just so folks know who you are at home, Lee, I know you've been with the town for a few years now. If you could just kind of give yourself a little introduction of who you are and what you've been doing for the town for all the years.
Sure. Lee Hartmann, Director of Planning and Development for the town of Plymouth. I started in town in 1987 as a town planner. I was then assistant town planner, and then I was planner, and I served for a number of years as assistant town manager. I went off to the consulting world as a planning consultant for a few years, and then came back in 2002 as the Director of Planning and Development. I've had the honor of serving in that position since 2002.
Oh, you forgot one position.
Oh, and I was also the acting town manager during the transition period between Melissa Origi and yourself.
Yes, you were acting town manager, so it was a great handoff from Lee to me back in 2002. And Lee, you know this, and I'll say it out loud, that you are one person that anytime I need advice, you're the person I go to for advice. You've always given me sound advice, so I always appreciate everything you've done.
Thank you.
And so we'll have you for at least another 10 more years here in town.
Sure.
So Judi, thank you for joining us. And I know you worked for the town in the past as well. So I think it'd be important for folks to understand, kind of what you've been doing and how you served the town in previous years.
So I started here about a year after Lee did. I was the community development director for 4 years and had an absolutely wonderful time. I often tell people that it was the best job I ever had. But today I am a consultant. Mm-hmm. I have a consulting firm in Hingham. I have 10 staff there and an 11th person who supports us remotely in GIS. So we're very busy doing a lot of work with MBTA Communities zoning this year, because you're not the only town that's subject to the law. We do a lot of comprehensive planning work, we do zoning work, and I do a lot of work in affordable and fair housing as well.
Great. I didn't realize how big your firm was.
Yeah.
Over 10 employees. Wow.
Yeah, it's some weeks it's scary.
Yeah, I bet. Well, so that's a great segue into today's topic. And so we're going to be talking about the MBTA Communities law. I believe it was passed a few years ago. Actually, under the Baker-Polito administration, that law originally had passed, and now under the new governor's leadership, Maura Healey, she continues to advance this new law. So there's been a lot of debate in the Commonwealth regarding this law. I think we'll touch upon what's going on in Milton, even maybe prior to that, what's going on in Holden. But Judi, we'll start with you. Can you just describe, so everybody understands, what this MBTA Communities law is?
Sure. So it was passed in 2021, and it's a fairly umbrella law. The legislature said communities that are classified as an MBTA community, which is 177 cities and towns around Boston out to Worcester, have to provide for what's called as-of-right multifamily zoning at a density of at least 15 units an acre. If you have a train station, then the law directs you to put most of that housing around the train station. If you don't have a train station in your community, then you're looking at what's called sort of an eligible location, which is other areas where there may be a kind of existing development and sort of neighborhood centers and so forth. So Plymouth, being subject to that law, had requested help to figure out, well, how do we go around complying with this? And we've been doing that in a lot of communities. So that's why we're here, really to help Lee and the planning board figure out a path to comply, hopefully, take it to town meeting, and then hopefully the state approves the zoning. So it's a fairly complicated law to implement. The legislature, as I said, wrote this very umbrella law, and then directed the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities to figure out how to make it work.
Right, how to implement it.
Yeah, exactly.
So just so it's clear to me and the viewers at home, because we're in a budding community of a MBTA train station, right? We have to now comply.
That's
correct. I think that was your point, about 177 communities fall within that regulation and have to comply.
Right.
So, Lee, I know there's been a lot of work over the past year plus to try to figure out how the town of Plymouth is going to comply. And we have an article coming up at the annual town meeting this coming April. Can you explain what the expectation is when we bring this forward to town meeting?
Sure. So first of all, I think it's important to note that this is a mandatory law, and we'll talk a little more about that later on. But the state has made it very clear that this is mandatory. The town does not have an option. We must comply with their law. So in Plymouth, since we're an abutting community, our train station at Cordage is not open and operational. So we're considered an abutting because we abut the Kingston train station. So because of that, our number for that we have to hit for zoning, and it's very important to note it's zoning only, doesn't require that the town build any units, but it's 2,807 units of zoning that needs to be in place that could hypothetically allow that level of development. So what we've done with Judi and her planning group is we identified early on a number of different possible sites in the town that could accommodate additional multifamily housing. We went through that process. We had a couple of public forums over the summer and fall, and then we met jointly with this planning board and select board. And again, we'll talk about it a little more, but the result of that is what we have now in Article 18 that will be going forward to town meeting seeking approval.
And what happens if town meeting votes against this proposal, this zoning proposal?
So there are several things that can happen. The first one is that we will no longer be eligible for several major grants that the town has been very aggressive at applying for and receiving over the years. In addition, there's about a dozen other grants that will lose what they call competitiveness. So there are about a dozen grants that we would be penalized for if we don't comply. And if you look over the past 5 years, we've received over $10 million in grant funding from these programs.
From those programs you're specifically talking about.
So if we fail to comply, we can say that, if the last 5 years, the next 5 years are similar, we're talking about a loss of probably $10 million in grants. And then the final thing, and I'll let Judi speak a little bit to this one, is that we will, I think, definitely face legal implications too. So again, the state has made it clear this is mandatory, and failure to comply will probably result in legal actions.
So before we jump over to Judi, because you're a quantum of vote guy, what does it take for town meeting to vote this forward? How many votes do we need?
So it's interesting that most zoning articles are a high bar of 2/3 vote, but this, because it is housing and housing production, will be a simple majority vote.
This is a majority vote.
Yeah, simple majority.
Wow, okay, that's interesting. So getting back to Lee's previous point, Judi, I know the town of Milton is in some hot water with the AG's office, and prior to that, the town of Holden had stated publicly that they weren't going to comply. So what are some of the legal ramifications to the town if we chose not to comply or move forward in this fashion, or two, if town meeting votes against this law?
So first of all, with regard to Plymouth, if town meeting voted against this in April, excuse me, if you have a fall town meeting, you could still go to fall town meeting, perhaps with a different proposal or modified.
Well, that's a good point. So when is this due? That's the other.
Your deadline to comply is December 31st of this year.
So we have to comply, show compliance by the end of this
Which means you have to have the zoning in place. Gotcha. So if you're fine until December 31st. But you have another bite of the apple, if you will, in terms of fall town meeting. And there are towns that are not going to town meeting in the fall, and there are many, many that are going in the spring, like you are.
This spring?
This spring, gotcha. Yes. We have many of those towns are our clients. So the Milton situation is kind of an unfortunate one. Town meeting had approved proposed zoning that was backed by the select board and a number of other people, and it passed. And then a group of folks in town who were unhappy with that vote organized sufficient signatures to call a referendum to essentially challenge the vote of town meeting. And that referendum vote passed, so the zoning was now off the table. And the town immediately lost a couple of grants. They had been put on notice for a couple of recent grant awards, that the grant awards were conditional upon complying with the MBTA Communities law. So when the town was now not in compliance, because their deadline to comply was December 31st, 2023, because they're a rapid transit community.
Ah, okay. That's
Towns
a
are
difference.
subject to different deadlines. So the rapid transit communities all had to have their zoning in place by December 2023. And Chelsea was one of our clients, and they made it. Milton had made it, and then the vote was overturned. So they lost a couple of grants that they had been awarded. And then this morning, just today, the Attorney General's office filed a complaint against the town seeking an order of the court to force the town to comply. And we don't know where that's going to go, but they're taking it seriously.
Yeah, that's interesting because I remember when this law first came out under the Baker-Polito administration, the threat, as you both pointed out, was always around grants.
Yeah.
If you don't comply, you're no longer going to be eligible for these grants. And there were some communities that called and said, keep your money. We'll fund our own projects and we don't need your money. But now it seems like the state is taking this further and they're starting to hold towns accountable for not complying.
Well, the law doesn't just say you lose these 3 grant programs.
Okay.
The law says you shall have a district. So I think part of what we're dealing with here is a little bit of muddiness in the legislation where the legislature saw fit to specify a remedy of the loss of those 3 grant programs. The whole point is, was that all? And the Attorney General's position is no, because the legislation also says you shall have a district. So shall is mandatory, therefore you will do it. And this is going to play out, I think, over the next many months.
Okay, that's an interesting point, different than what I've heard. So again, when you start to use the word shall,
Yes.
it's mandatory, as
That's
you pointed
right.
out. So interesting. So Lee, you talked about approximately we have to approve in zoning about 2,807 units. And you have gone through a process trying to engage community, get feedback from the community in order to get there. So based upon the summation of your work, what does this mean for the town?
Yeah, and again, that 2,807 unit is just zoning. It doesn't require that a single unit be built. But again, as we went through the public forums, we met jointly with the select board and planning board, what we've heard from the community is we as a town have already had an incredible amount of new growth that's gone into the town, residential growth that we see everywhere. And so the community came to us and said, why don't we take credit for the multifamily that's already in place? And let's look at putting this where we've already done multifamily, taking credit for the multifamily there now and minimizing the impact of yet more residential growth in the town. So what we've done is put an overlay district over Cottage Park, the multifamily, I should say. So it's not the commercial piece, but the multifamily at Cottage Park, the multifamily you see at Colony Place, Sawyer's Reach, and the Walk 40B, the 40B we see Oasis off of Home Depot Drive, and the multifamily that you see at Pine Hills. So again, only that multifamily. So we've superimposed the district over those areas. So ultimately, I expect that hopefully town meeting approves this article, and when they do, there really will be no impact on the community. We'll meet their compliance, but by complying, the way we comply is to take credit for what we've already done for multifamily.
And so this is an overlay district? Is that,
Yes.
Judy, could you mind explaining for folks who don't really understand what that means and how we're able to fit this square peg in this round hole with using these already existing projects?
Yes. So the beauty of using an overlay district is that you can kind of place it over existing zoning where a particular activity makes sense. So it doesn't necessarily have to apply to an entire underlying district, but only selected locations that make sense from a valid planning perspective. And that's really what we did. We had presented other options in addition to these to try to get a response from the community. Well, what do you think makes sense? And these were the locations that most people said, and of course the select board and planning board reinforced on October 25th, that these were the locations that made the most sense. So you're selectively placing the overlay where you've made valid planning decisions.
Yep.
It would make sense to have multifamily housing because you've already got it or you've already permitted it.
Right. So I think one question, as you're talking, Judy, I'm thinking, some town meeting members will ask, well, now if we were to approve this overlay district, does that allow the existing property owners or developers to build even more housing in those areas?
And I would say no,
Okay.
because of the density of the development. And we didn't pick neighborhoods with single family or lower
Right.
development. We picked areas that have higher density development. So
Already.
So the 15 unit per acre reference number, that is the density of what you see, roughly the density of what you see at Oasis, which is off of Home Depot Drive, or the Walk, which is behind Colony Place. So again, we only pick those areas that already have that higher density development.
Right, so they're already complying with that.
And again, so I think it's incredibly unlikely that we see any additional housing units coming out of this.
I mean, if you did, it would be a de minimis
Yes.
difference.
Okay. Well, I think that's going to question that. Certainly, that's going to come
Yeah.
up. And so, when this bylaw was created, I know you've been working with the planning board on this very closely. Who was involved with drafting this new law for the townspeople?
Sure, there are a couple things. So first of all, we relied heavily on Judi, who has a lot of experience and has worked on a number of different communities' bylaws. So Judi did some of the initial drafting, myself, the building commissioner, people from the town planners, and the other building inspecting agents in his department. We all had a little say in it. We all worked on it. And town council has reviewed it and approved it too. So it was a cooperative effort between a number of different people to.
And if I could ask, because this always comes up at town meeting, the bylaw that's going to be presented at town meeting will need the AG's approval, correct?
Correct.
The Attorney General will have to approve this once it goes to town meeting.
We believe it will, yes.
It will, okay. Yeah, because I think that's something
I mean,
that's-
I'm always reluctant to speak for the Attorney General, but I mean, I think we're in good shape.
And that's one of the questions we asked town council. In addition to
Yeah.
Judy's expertise, that's one of the questions we asked the council is not only is this bylaw technically correct and meets the legal standard, but is there anything here that could run afoul of the Attorney General? And so that's a very important question on all zoning articles we present that council reviews.
So, Doug, actually, you ask a very important question, though, and I just want to make this clear
Sure.
to folks. Unlike any other zoning that you do, the town has two masters in this case. One is the Attorney General approving it as to legal form. And then there's the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities, which the legislature charged with responsibility for determining compliance. So the work that was done to identify these locations and then analyze them for potential development from a zoning perspective, that was all done with a compliance model that was developed by Housing and Livable Communities. And the town will have to submit the whole package to them, just as it will have to submit to the Attorney General's office. So it's
we're
a
gonna be
different creature.
We're going to be looking for 2 approvals.
Yes, you will.
Interesting. One item, and we have about 10 minutes left, and I know we have a number of questions I still want to ask, but one item that will come up is affordable housing. So we've talked a lot about affordable housing in this town,
Yep.
especially leading up to town meeting with a couple of CPC articles that are coming up. Does this have any component of affordability in it?
So it's interesting that the focus here is solely housing production. So they do allow for affordable, but the focus of this law is not affordable housing. So what we've built into this is more or less typical to what we already do in town, which is require that 10% of the housing units be affordable. And the law does not allow us to exceed that 10%. So we comply with the law, we do the 10%, which is very similar to what we already do in every other development in the town.
So it already works nicely with our already pre-existing operations.
Yeah.
Okay. What about the issues around Title V and the Wetlands Protection Act? How is any of that going to play into
So
this?
this is only zoning. So like with any other development, compliance with zoning is just one of the things I have to check off. I also have to comply with Title V for septic, wastewater. I have to comply with the Wetlands Protection Act. I have to comply with the town's local wetlands bylaw, which is a non-zoning bylaw.
Okay.
Anything that would otherwise apply outside of zoning, I still have to comply with. So none of those other controls is minimized or affected by the zoning. The zoning is simply around the use and the density, and everything else still applies.
Okay. Well, that's good to know, especially for the folks that are paying attention. So the Conservation Commission would still have to get involved.
Absolutely.
The ZBA may have to get involved in those situations. I know, hearing Governor Haley talk publicly, and I want to say the number that she has pronounced is that the state as a whole is short about 55,000 units,
Yeah, that sounds
somewhere
right.
in that range. And I know we're talking about approximately 2,800 units that we have to zone for.
Right.
But I do know that there's also another risk that's out there, another threat, I should say. We've had at one point a commuter rail at Cottage. And that was closed because, during the years of the pandemic. And I know that we had conversations, I know Lee and I had conversations of trying to think about ways that we could restart the commuter rail. If Plymouth can continue to progress, it's going to need a commuter rail stop again in the future. But how would this law impact the town of Plymouth if that train station were to reopen?
So it's a fair question, and I don't think we've dodged it here. I think that if the train station were functional, you would now be a commuter rail community, not an adjacent town. So there are these tiers
Okay.
of classification, and you're right now an adjacent town because you don't have a functional train station. If you had one, that would increase the number of units that you need to zone for, and also would raise the station area radius question. And all I can tell you is what we understand is that at that point the town would need to comply with the now different classification. The best I can say to anybody is cross that bridge if it happens.
Sure.
It's not an issue now. We don't know if it's going to be an issue in the future. I can understand people's concerns, but not passing this zoning doesn't make any of that go away.
Right.
So,
Yeah, I think part of the question is really from the executive branch will be, do we want to pursue, we'll still work with our state delegation on reopening that?
Sure.
Because if the answer is yes, then we know that we're going to have to contend, I think, right, with
Yeah.
adding additional units. And
Right.
so, what are the unintended consequences
Sure.
of adding additional units because of opening the Cottage?
And I would also point out that should town meeting approve this and this gets adopted and the train station opens, I think our first order of action is to see if there's some way to have us grandfathered under what we've done and not make it subject to yet a new standard. So I think that would be our first defense, to say, look, we've done what we were required, we complied, please don't make us do this all over. So that would be the first step. I would point out too that the number would go from 2,807 units to 4,200, with a requirement that some of those 4,200, a larger percentage, has to be located near the train station. So
I knew you would remember that number.
it's a far greater impact on the community and on North Plymouth if that train station opens. So again, as Judi pointed out, it's unknown what will happen, but again, if it does open, that is something we'll have to be dealing with, and the impacts are far greater. We go from 10% to 15%, and that, again, that number is 4,200 units.
Yeah, so that's an additional 1,400 units, and I think you said it, Lee. It would be those additional 1,400 units. If we went down that road, would be solely focused in the North Plymouth area, where right now we kind of spread out the 2,800 units throughout the community.
We'd have to look at the model and what flexibility we have, but it would focus a lot more on that northern part of the town.
But that's a future discussion, I think,
Yeah.
as you pointed out, Judi.
Yeah.
Right now, we're focused on 2,800 units, going to town meeting. I think it's April 5th coming up. And speaking of that, who has already supported this article? I know you had a bunch of presentations already, Lee.
So this has been unanimously supported by the Planning Board, the Select Board, and the Advisory and Finance Committee. So again, I think doing all the outreach we did, meeting with the community, listening to their concerns, it does show that we have unanimous support so far going to town meeting.
Yeah, it was impressive. I mean, I can tell you, I'm working in a lot of other communities. Plymouth have always said this about Plymouth. You're just different and you're better, and it really came through in those meetings.
Well, that's great to hear. And I do know as we head into the month of March, the precincts are going to start holding their caucuses. Are there any intentions to attend those caucus meetings, answer questions for town meeting members?
We will do the best we can. At 18, as you know, it's quite the journey to go through 18 of those meetings, and that doesn't include some of the others. For example, we're already slated to go to the Committee of Precinct Chairs, and we'll be presenting to them. And there could be other presentations too, but yes, we'll we'll try to hit as many as people would like us to.
Well, yeah, no, I think that's a good offer to put out there to the chairs of those precincts. I do know the Wednesday before town meeting, I think there's 6 caucuses held on one Wednesday. So
Wow.
I don't know how you guys can split yourself amongst 6 caucuses, the 2 of you, so good luck. But before we break, I kind of already asked this question, but I want to ask it again. So what happens if town meeting doesn't approve it? What are we going to do?
Then we'll go back to the drawing board, listen to whatever concerns, and it's very hard to say what
Yeah.
this, you have so many people in town meeting. Oftentimes people say, well, town meeting said. Well, it's really hard to say what to get into the minds of all those town meeting members. But we'd go back to the drawing board based on what we might have heard for concerns and see what we can come back for an alternative. But again, I'm pretty confident based on what we've heard from the community, we've put something together that will satisfy the state, but also address the majority of concerns we've heard in the community.
In town meeting, in my 2 years in this community, overall is very supportive of recommendations that come through the administration. I think to your point, because the legwork has already been put into it, you try to answer those questions ahead of time. So typically, and again, a simple majority, it's not a big lift compared to most zoning articles, which is a 2/3 vote, correct? So that's good. That's good to know. So the last thing I want to just ask, does this have any bearing on the housing production plan? Are they two separate?
They're two totally separate issues. And again, I'd stress the fact that I don't think we're going to see a huge impact or any impact out of this once it's adopted. So I don't think we're going to see any kind of significant, what your term was, de minimis, if there was anything that came from this. So again, I think it's really complying with the law, meeting the state's mandate, taking credit for what we've done. So again, I don't see any impact. Housing production plan is totally different anyway. But yeah, I don't think this.
And I ask because I know we just passed the housing production plan this past January. Now we're rolling into this new MBTA Communities, which affects housing. So folks may get them
Well,
a little
there's a
confused.
key difference between them. This is about zoning. Housing production plan's about production.
Good point.
And it
Very
has
different.
And it has a bigger focus on affordable housing, whereas this state mandated law really is focusing more on simply housing production, not affordable housing.
So we're going to wrap up.
Yep.
Where can folks get more information?
So we do have a website. So if you go to the planning boards, it goes to go to the town's website and then go to the page for the planning board. There is a page there for MBTA Communities that is there, and it includes the presentations we've made, the bylaw itself, the initial plan that you prepared that went through the original sites that we looked at. So that is all on the town's website. And certainly I'm very accessible. If anybody has any comments or concerns or wants to contact me, they can reach out directly to me.
Great. That's great.
And Lee will call me.
All right. Well, Judi, thank you,
Thank you.
For coming this afternoon. Lee, thank you for coming. And for all you at home, thank you for joining us. As Lee pointed out, if you want more information, please go to our website at www.plymouth-ma.gov, Planning Board section, and you can find all information you're looking for on the Article 18 MBTA Communities Law. Thank you, and I'll see you next time.